Time for Options Corner. Rick Ducat, our lead market technician, here in studio with us to take a look at all things AMD on the heels of this huge news of this OpenAI deal. Like Sam just mentioned, Rick, we are seeing AMD shares up about 25% right now. They were up as much as 35% on this news. But as we look more broadly at its performance against the broader market and the sector, how is it stacking up?
It took this big move to bring it back up on par with the S&P 500 after a very severe decline. And if you see, too, it's still quite underperforming the tech sector, up about 28% versus AMD up about 29%. So if we were to look at the chip makers more specifically, though, once again, kind of near the bottom here, outpacing only Qualcomm and only after today, after this big move today, but underneath the SMH index. Meanwhile, NVIDIA, Intel, and Broadcom are showing some nice moves overall here. But really, it's all relative, I mean, it depends on where you got in, where you're getting out here. If you happen to be lucky enough to take advantage of AMD's severe dip during the tariff news shock here, you're probably pretty happy today.
And it's a very interesting thing, as we look at these chip stocks, a lot of them been so headline dependent of late. We've seen so many of these huge moves to the upside. Of course, Intel in here, NVIDIA now being highly responsive to news from other chip makers. But, AMD, the latest to get a boost. Broadcom also got a recent boost. But, very interesting that you mentioned, it depends where you got in. Because if you hit it before a major headline or a major event, we've seen quite a lot of movement in this space.
And don't forget, headlines work both ways. This is a very tariff-sensitive, trade war-sensitive area right now here, but a lot of the news seems to have been more positive for. But here we look at our technicals now. Kind of thrown for a loop at this point here. The best we can do in terms of near-term support and resistance is kind of the highs and the lows of the day here. We're kind of at that point where that's the most relevant thing. And, 205 was roughly where the low point was. Sadly, it moved a little bit since I drew the line, just, kind of throwing me for a loop there with that one. But the highs, 186.65, that would be 1 point to consider for potential support. You could also look at this old trend line here. Starting here, connecting these lows fairly decently here, matching up here, then it was broken. But, these trend lines, they can come back into play down the road, even after they've been significantly breached. You might expect to find in the coming days that this could be a boundary to the downside here. Look for it to come in between, maybe 200 to 205, depending on where the price moves. Now, if we assess our other studies here, well, RSI, pretty strong move to the upside, not really a surprise there. But now the piece of information to think about here is when we get the decline back below the overbought area, because that would mean it was more of a bearish signal, and perhaps things are starting to slow down. But now, moving averages, volume profile, all this stuff. This would have been great yesterday, but not really much help today here. For now, though, the best thing we can come up with is standard deviation channels. So what we do is compare the stock's volatility to itself, basically, to see how extreme the move is. So between +2 and +3 channels right now, notice we pretty close to where the +3 channel came in is where we stopped out, a little bit beyond that. But those are about 223 and 197 right now. So consider those as potential shorter term fence posts here.
And it's harder to look, obviously, on a day where we're seeing such a massive move. But in terms of analyst response to this, we do discuss news in this segment as well. How has it been received, this news about AMD?
Price target hikes from Roth Capital, Benchmark, and Barclays. Barclays had the biggest push to the upside, 200 to 300. Pretty big numbers there, keeping their overweight rating here. And, one thing, too, is that I thought it was interesting to look at the long-term chart here. So when we see this, these old highs that we experienced here, that area near 187 is even more important than it seemed because it was the site of the highs 2 other times in the past here. And the high point we saw today is right about at those old highs. So now those same general areas we talked about in the shorter term are significant in the longer term as well here. To consider the options market for the the October 17th move, 10.7% in only 11 days. So some pretty big numbers here. Really not lining up with anything specific except for these older highs here to the downside. But at that point, it could just be a coincidence right at that point here because things are moving around so quickly. But general broad range, about a little under 11% move expected.
And you said, as we looked at the charts against the broader chip makers, it's still a bit of a laggard even with that upward movement. As far as options activity, are we seeing it predominantly in calls and puts today? And what's the volume been like?
Mostly we are seeing it in the call side, about 61% calls, 1.3 million options traded hands at the time I checked this here. Open interest for the month, mostly on the call side as well, 53 to 47% here. I did see one trade that really caught my eye though, minus 7,000 January 16th, 290 strike calls at a 756 credit, $5.4 million credit received roughly. Biggest volume trade. Normally I do opening trades, but this one was a closing trade. I thought it was interesting because they looked like they paid 67 cents on September 2nd for 8,000 of them. So they made about 11.5 times their profits. They only paid about $470K for it. They still have 1,000 that are letting it ride too. So they didn't even close out the whole position, probably just locking in these windfall profits from this move and keeping a little bit on the table then.
Just in case there's further, as you always say, it can always go up. You always say that to me and it always can. But thank you so much, Rick Ducat, for being with us.